Look at yourself in the mirror. Your face, your hands, the shape of your head. Now, imagine going back in time 70,000 years to meet your ancient relative. You know what's amazing? They would look almost exactly like you. Same height, same brain size, same face shape. If you cleaned them up, gave them a haircut and modern clothes, they could walk down any street in any city today and nobody would notice. But here's where it gets strange. Go back another 70,000 years to 140,000 years ago, and you would still see basically the same thing. Go back to 200,000 years ago when modern humans first appeared. And except for some small differences, you're looking at the same species, the same body, the same biology. For 200,000 years, we've been frozen. While we've built civilizations, invented computers, split the atom, and sent spacecraft beyond our solar system, our bodies haven't changed. Our evolution has stopped. Or more correctly, it slowed down to almost nothing right around 70,000 years ago. And the reason why is one of the most amazing stories in all of human history. If you're using this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these videos. So maybe hit subscribe and definitely tell me in the comments where you are and what time it is right now. I love checking and seeing like Tokyo at sunrise, London at lunch, Los Angeles at midnight, all watching together. It's kind of beautiful when you think about it. Now, you might be thinking, wait, evolution takes millions of years. How can we even tell if it stopped just 70,000 years ago? Good question. And the answer is we can tell because we have a natural experiment, a comparison group. Because 70,000 years ago, something happened that should have sped up human evolution into overdrive. Instead, it did the opposite. It marked the moment when biology stopped maturing and culture took over. The event was called Toba, and it nearly ended humanity before we really got started. Picture this. It's 74,000 years ago, give or take a few thousand years. Modern humans have been around for about 130,000 years at this point, but we're not doing great. We're scattered across Africa and maybe just starting to explore beyond. We're smart. We've got language. We can make tools. But we're just another species trying to survive. We're not special yet. We're not in charge. We're just one more type of human among several competing for resources with Neanderthals in Europe and Denisovans in Asia. Then in what's now Sumatra, Indonesia, a volcano called Mount Toba erupts. But this isn't just any eruption. This is a supervolcano, the biggest volcanic eruption in the last 2 million years. The explosion is so huge it throws out 670 cubic miles of rock and ash into the air. That's enough material to bury the entire United States under 2 feet of volcanic debris. The ash cloud spreads across the entire planet within weeks. It blocks out the sun. World temperatures drop by up to 15 degrees in some places. In the tropics, where most humans lived, temperatures dropped enough to kill off plants and mess up ecosystems completely. Animals died in huge numbers. Plants died. Water sources became filled with volcanic ash. This is what scientists call a volcanic winter. And it might have lasted for years, maybe decades. Some models suggest the climate effects continued for 1,000 years. Imagine living through that, not knowing if the sky would ever clear, not knowing if the animals would ever return, not knowing if your children would have anything to eat next year or the year after that. The genetic evidence suggests that human populations crashed hard. Some guesses put the total number of breeding humans left on Earth at around 10,000 individuals. Other more extreme models suggest as few as 2,000. Out of however many humans existed before, maybe hundreds of thousands, we were reduced to a handful of survivors grouped in a few safe zones where conditions remained barely okay to live in. This is what scientists call a population bottleneck. And you can see this mark written in our DNA today. All 8 billion humans currently alive have remarkably low genetic diversity compared to other species. Chimpanzees, who number less than 300,000, have more genetic variation than all of humanity combined. That's the fingerprint of Toba. That's the mark of near extinction. But here's the thing that scientists didn't expect. After Toba, human evolution didn't speed up. It slowed down dramatically. See, normally when a species goes through a severe bottleneck like this, evolution speeds up. You've got a small population facing extreme environmental pressure. Natural selection should be working overtime, favoring individuals with helpful traits. removing anything that doesn't help survival. You'd expect to see rapid evolutionary changes as the population adapts to the new conditions. But that's not what happened to us. Instead, something never before seen occurred. Humans stopped evolving through biology and started evolving through culture. We didn't adapt to the environment by growing thicker fur or developing different body shapes. We adapted by inventing better tools, creating more advanced social structures, developing new hunting strategies, and sharing knowledge across generations. Around 70,000 years ago, right after the Toba bottleneck, the archaeological record shows an explosion of what scientists call behavioral modernity. Suddenly you see evidence of art, jewelry, advanced weapons, long-distance trade networks, ritual behavior, and complex social organization. It's like someone flipped a switch in the human brain. This is what anthropologists call the cognitive revolution or the Great Leap Forward. And it changed everything. Because once humans could solve problems through innovation rather than adaptation, once we could survive by thinking differently rather than being different, biological evolution became almost irrelevant. Think about it. If the climate gets colder, most animals need to evolve thicker fur over thousands of generations. Humans? We just invent clothing and build fires. Problem solved in one generation, and the solution gets passed down through culture, not genes. If prey animals get faster, most predators need to evolve to be faster, too. Humans? We invent better weapons. We develop pack hunting strategies. We share information about animal behavior. From 70,000 years ago to today, our bodies have remained basically unchanged. Same brain size, actually slightly smaller on average. Same bone structure. Same basic body functions. But our abilities have exploded tremendously. Not because we evolved biologically, but because we evolved culturally. And that's what makes this story so incredible. For millions of years, human evolution worked like every other species. Random mutations, natural selection, survival of the fittest. Then 70,000 years ago, we broke the rules. We found a cheat code. We figured out how to evolve without evolving. But the question remains, did evolution really stop? Or is something more subtle happening? Are we still evolving in ways we don't recognize? And what does it mean for our future? Over the next few hours, we're going to explore this mystery together. We'll look at the Toba catastrophe in detail and examine the genetic evidence for the bottleneck. We'll investigate the cognitive revolution and try to understand what changed in the human mind. We'll explore why natural selection stopped shaping our bodies the way it shapes other species. We'll dig into the fossil record and see what ancient bones tell us about evolutionary pause. And we'll look at the exceptions, the few small ways humans have actually evolved in the last 70,000 years, because they're fascinating. By the end, you'll understand one of the most important transitions in the history of life on Earth. The moment when one species stopped being controlled by evolution and started directing it instead. So, settle in, get comfortable. Let's go back 70,000 years to the moment when human evolution froze and everything changed. Forever. 74,000 years ago, something happened that almost ended humanity before we'd barely begun. Not a meteor strike, not an alien invasion, not even a worldwide sickness. What nearly wiped us out was a mountain in Indonesia that decided to explode with a force of several million nuclear bombs going off at the same time. This was Toba, the largest volcanic eruption in 2 million years. The kind of event that makes modern disasters look like minor problems. When Toba went off, it didn't just erupt. It basically destroyed itself, throwing so much material into the air that it completely changed Earth's climate for generations. We're talking about 2,800 cubic kilometers of ash, rock, and volcanic material launched into the upper atmosphere. To put that in perspective, Mount St. Helens, which people still talk about as a major eruption, threw out about 1 cubic kilometer. Toba was 2,800 times larger. The explosion was so powerful that volcanic debris landed as far as 3,000 miles away. Ash layers from Toba have been found in India, in the Indian Ocean, in East Africa. Locations that would have been completely buried under gray toxic snow. But the immediate explosion wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was what came after. All that material thrown into the upper atmosphere formed a thick blanket around the entire planet. Sulfur dioxide combined with water vapor to create sulfuric acid droplets that reflected sunlight back into space. Within weeks, the world temperature began dropping. Within months, the planet was experiencing what scientists call a volcanic winter, a period of long-lasting darkness and cold that would last for years, possibly decades. Think about what that means. You're a human living 74,000 years ago. Your world is already challenging. You're hunting and gathering, living in small groups, constantly moving to find food. Your survival depends entirely on your knowledge of the environment, the seasonal patterns, the migration routes of animals, the fruiting times of plants. Your ancestors have been building this knowledge for thousands of generations. Then suddenly all the rules change. The sky turns gray. Ash falls like snow, covering everything in a toxic blanket. Temperatures drop. Plants stop growing. Animals start dying. The rivers and lakes become filled with sediment. This wasn't a brief crisis. Current guesses suggest the volcanic winter lasted between 6 and 10 years. 6 to 10 years of reduced sunlight, failed harvests, collapsing ecosystems. For a species that lived hand-to-mouth, that depended on consistent food sources, this was world-ending. And the effects didn't end when the ash finally settled. The climate disruption triggered a long cold period that lasted for 1,000 years. World temperatures dropped by an average of 3 to 5 degrees. In some regions, particularly at higher latitudes, the drop was much more severe. 3 to 5 degrees might not sound like much. We experience bigger temperature swings between summer and winter. But we're talking about average world temperatures held over centuries. That kind of change transforms entire ecosystems. Forests die back. Grasslands turn to semi-desert. Water sources dry up. The animals humans depended on either died off or moved to regions where they couldn't be followed. For our ancestors, this was the end of the world. And humanity nearly ended with it. The evidence for this catastrophe is written in our DNA. Every cell in your body carries the genetic mark of what happened 74,000 years ago. The proof that we came closer to extinction than any other point in our species' history. It's a field of study that sounds almost like science fiction, but it's based on rock-solid molecular biology. We can read the history of human population crashes in the same way we read tree rings or ice cores, by analyzing patterns in our genetic code that only appear under very specific circumstances. The key evidence comes from something called mitochondrial DNA. Unlike the DNA in your cell nucleus, which you inherit from both parents, mitochondrial DNA comes only from your mother. She got it from her mother, who got it from her mother, going back in an unbroken maternal line to the very beginning of humanity. And here's what makes it so valuable for studying ancient population sizes. Mitochondrial DNA mutates at a relatively steady rate, about one mutation every 3,500 years. When scientists sequence mitochondrial DNA from people all over the world, they can build a family tree showing how all those maternal lineages relate to each other. They can calculate when different branches split apart. And most importantly, they can estimate the size of the ancestral population based on how much genetic diversity exists today. When scientists did this analysis, they found something shocking. All living humans, all 8 billion of us, can trace our maternal ancestry back to a population of between 3,000 and 10,000 individuals who lived around 70,000 to 80,000 years ago. That's it. 3 to 10,000 people. The genetic diversity in all of humanity is less than you'd find in a single troop of chimpanzees, less than a typical population of gorillas. We're one of the least genetically diverse large mammals on the planet. And the timing matches perfectly with the Toba eruption. But the mitochondrial evidence is just the beginning. Scientists also looked at Y chromosome DNA, which passes from father to son in an unbroken paternal line. Different genetic material, different inheritance pattern, but the same result. A massive population bottleneck around 70,000 years ago that reduced human genetic diversity to a fraction of what it should be for a species our age. Then they looked at regular nuclear DNA, the kind you inherit from both parents. Same story. Every genetic analysis using every available method points to the same conclusion. Something catastrophic happened to humanity around 74,000 years ago. Something that reduced our population to numbers so small that we should have gone extinct. Think about how close that was. 3,000 individuals. That's not even enough to fill a modern high school. That's fewer people than live in most small towns, spread across an entire continent, maybe two if some population survived in Asia. Groups so separated that they might go months or years without meeting other humans. This wasn't just a population decline. This was humanity balanced on the absolute edge of extinction. And we can see the demographic collapse in other evidence, too. The archaeological record from this period shows a dramatic reduction in the number of human sites. Locations that had been continuously occupied for thousands of years were suddenly abandoned. Tool technologies that had been spreading across Africa suddenly stopped expanding. Trade networks that had been moving exotic materials hundreds of miles collapsed. The archaeological mark looks exactly like what you'd expect from a species experiencing near-total population collapse. Some researchers have pushed back on the Toba catastrophe theory. They point out that not all climate records show dramatic cooling at exactly 74,000 years ago. They note that some archaeological sites seem to show continuity through the period. They argue that maybe the bottleneck wasn't as severe or as sudden as the genetic evidence suggests. But here's the thing. The genetic evidence doesn't lie. Something reduced human genetic diversity dramatically during this period. Maybe it was Toba. Maybe it was Toba plus a series of other climate disasters that hit around the same time. Maybe the volcanic winter was just the trigger that pushed already stressed populations past the breaking point. The exact mechanism matters to archaeologists and climate scientists. But for understanding human evolution, what matters is the result. Humanity went through a bottleneck so severe that it permanently changed our species' genetic path. Because here's what a genetic bottleneck really means. When a population crashes to extremely low numbers, you lose genetic variation. Lots of it. Random mutations that have been building up in the larger population simply disappear because the individuals carrying them died without having children. Rare genetic variants vanish. The overall diversity of the gene pool shrinks dramatically. It's like taking a deck of cards with thousands of different designs, and suddenly you're left with only 3 or 4 types. Even if the population later expands, even if it grows back to millions or billions of individuals, the genetic diversity never fully recovers. All those future generations are shuffling the same limited deck of cards. This has big implications for evolution. Evolution depends on genetic variation. Natural selection can only work if there are different traits to select from. If everyone in a population is genetically similar, there's less raw material for evolution to work with. Fewer mutations means fewer chances for helpful adaptations to arise. Less diversity means slower evolutionary change. The Toba bottleneck basically hit the pause button on human physical evolution. But it gets even more specific than that. When scientists analyze which parts of the human genome show the least variation, they can identify the genetic regions that were most affected by the bottleneck. And here's where it gets really interesting. The genes that control basic physical features, body size, bone structure, facial features, these show remarkably low variation across all human populations. Why? Because the bottleneck locked in a specific physical form. The humans who survived Toba, those 3,000 to 10,000 individuals, they had a particular body plan, a particular bone structure, a particular set of physical characteristics. And because the population that survived was so small, those specific traits became basically fixed in the human lineage. Think about it this way. Before Toba, the human population probably included more physical variation. Taller individuals and shorter ones, more robust builds and more graceful ones, different skull shapes, different bone densities, all the normal variation you'd expect in a large widespread species. But when 95% or more of the population died, that variation collapsed. The survivors weren't a representative sample of all human variation. They were just whoever happened to be in the right place at the right time with the right combination of luck and survival skills. Their physical characteristics became the template for all future humans. This is why humans today, despite living on every continent and in every climate, are remarkably physically similar. Yes, we have variations in skin color, hair texture, eye shape, but these are surface adaptations to local conditions that evolved relatively recently. The basic human body plan, the bone structure, the internal organ systems, the fundamental physical architecture, This has been basically unchanged for 70,000 years. We're all built on the same frame because that frame was locked in during the bottleneck. And the genetic evidence shows something else remarkable. Not only did the bottleneck reduce our overall genetic diversity, it also selected for specific traits. Remember, the individuals who survived weren't random. They survived because they had characteristics that helped them endure a long crisis. Intelligence, certainly, the ability to innovate, to develop new survival strategies when old ones failed. Social cooperation, absolutely. No individual could have survived the volcanic winter alone. Only groups that worked together, shared resources, and maintained social unity made it through. Adaptability, probably the most important trait of all. The ability to shift diets when preferred foods disappeared, the capacity to move to new territories when familiar ones became unlivable, the mental flexibility to learn new skills quickly. These aren't physical traits. They're behavioral and mental characteristics. And here's the crucial point. The bottleneck selected for these traits so strongly that they became basically universal in the human population. Every human alive today is descended from ancestors who survived by being smart, cooperative, and adaptable. These mental traits, more than any physical features, define what it means to be human. And they were crystallized during those desperate thousands of years when anything less than peak mental performance meant death. But there's another effect of the bottleneck that's even more subtle. When a population crashes and then expands again, something called founder effects come into play. The individuals who survive the bottleneck carry only a subset of the original population's genetic variants. As their descendants spread and multiply, they're all working from that limited genetic palette. Random genetic drift, the process by which certain genes become more or less common purely by chance, becomes much more powerful in small populations. Traits that might have been rare before the bottleneck can become common afterward. Not because they're helpful, but just because the individuals who carried them happen to survive. This means some of our current human characteristics might not be adaptations at all. They might just be the result of which specific individuals made it through. That particular shape of our chin? Maybe not an adaptation for speech or anything else. Maybe just a random feature that happened to be present in the bottleneck survivors. The specific proportions of our limbs could be optimized for efficient walking, or could just be frozen-in features from that critical moment when the population shrank. We can't always tell the difference between adaptive traits and founder effects, but the genetic evidence suggests both played roles in shaping modern humans. The mitochondrial DNA evidence tells us something else fascinating. That population of 3,000 to 10,000 survivors? They weren't evenly spread out. The genetic analysis shows most of them were in Africa, probably concentrated in a few refuges, locations that remained livable during the worst of the climate crisis. Possibly East Africa, where the geography created small climates that softened some of the temperature extremes. Possibly Southern Africa, where coastal resources might have provided reliable food when inland areas became unlivable. The exact locations are still debated, but the pattern is clear. Humanity shrank to a few small pockets of survivable territory and held on to existence there for thousands of years. Some populations might have survived outside Africa, possibly in parts of Asia or even Europe. But if they did, they left no descendants in the modern human lineage. The genetic evidence is clear. All living humans trace their ancestry to that African population that made it through the bottleneck. Everyone else, if they existed, either died out or were absorbed back into the main population later. This is why Africa shows the highest genetic diversity of any continent. It's where humanity rode out the crisis. It's where the population began expanding again. It's our species' home base in the most literal sense. And here's the really sobering part. We got lucky. There was nothing certain about humanity surviving Toba. If the eruption had been slightly larger, if the volcanic winter had lasted a few years longer, if the survivors had been in locations that became just slightly more unlivable, we wouldn't be here. Human evolution would have ended 74,000 years ago with a species that showed great promise but couldn't quite make it past a planet-scale disaster. The fossil record is full of evolutionary dead ends, species that thrived for millions of years and then vanished when conditions changed. We came terrifyingly close to being another one of those footnotes in geological history. But we survived. And that survival came at a cost that we're still living with today. The genetic bottleneck locked in our physical form. It reduced our genetic diversity to a fraction of what it should be. It made us vulnerable to genetic diseases that wouldn't affect more diverse species. But it also crystallized the mental and social traits that would eventually allow us to dominate the planet. We emerged from Toba physically frozen but mentally supercharged. A species that would stop evolving physically but would never stop evolving culturally. The Toba catastrophe was the turning point, the moment that set humanity on a new evolutionary path. Before Toba, we were just another hominin species, probably not much different from Neanderthals or Denisovans or a dozen other human relatives. After Toba, we were something else. A species shaped by survival through the worst crisis imaginable. A species whose evolution had shifted from physical adaptation to mental innovation. A species that had traded genetic diversity for mental unity. We didn't know it at the time, of course. Those survivors huddled in their African refuges, struggling to find food, watching the gray sky, wondering if the world would ever return to normal. They had no idea they were founding a new chapter in human evolution. They were just trying to survive one more day. But their success in that desperate struggle changed everything about how human evolution would proceed. They created the genetic foundation for all future humanity. And that foundation, forged in crisis and catastrophe, would prove to be both our greatest limitation and our most powerful advantage. Around 70,000 years ago, something extraordinary happened to our species. Something that would completely change the path of human evolution forever. It wasn't a genetic mutation. It wasn't a sudden increase in brain size. Our ancestors had already developed large brains hundreds of thousands of years earlier. No, this was different. This was the moment when culture became more powerful than biology. When learning replaced evolution as our main adaptation method. Anthropologists call it the cognitive revolution. But that name doesn't quite capture what actually happened. It wasn't that humans suddenly became capable of thinking. Neanderthals could think. Denisovans could think. Even earlier human species had impressive mental abilities. What happened around 70,000 years ago was that human thinking became connected, systematic, building up over time. We developed the ability to not just solve problems, but to remember the solutions, teach them to others, and build upon them generation after generation. The archaeological evidence for this transformation is startling. Before 70,000 years ago, stone tools change very slowly over time. A hand axe from 300,000 years ago looks remarkably similar to one from 100,000 years ago. Different continents, different human species, hundreds of thousands of years apart, and the technology is basically identical. Then suddenly, around 70,000 years ago, everything changes. The African archaeological record explodes with innovation. Advanced stone blades appear, made using techniques that require years of training to master. Bone tools show up for the first time. Fish hooks, needles, awls, advanced tools designed for specific purposes. But the real revolution wasn't in the tools themselves. It was in what those tools represented. Standardization. Archaeological sites separated by hundreds of miles show identical tool designs. This isn't convergent evolution, different groups independently developing similar solutions. This is transmission. People teaching other people exactly how to make specific tools, trading finished products across vast distances, creating shared technological traditions that spread faster than any genetic adaptation could. And then there's the art. Before 70,000 years ago, you find almost nothing that could be called artistic expression in the human archaeological record. A few scratch lines on bones, maybe some ochre pigments that might have been used for body decoration. Nothing systematic, nothing that clearly represents symbolic thinking. Then, starting around 75,000 years ago in South Africa, we find the Blombos cave artifacts. Pieces of ochre engraved with geometric patterns, deliberately shaped, clearly decorative. Not functional tools, but objects created to convey meaning. Shell beads carefully drilled and strung together as jewelry. Abstract patterns scratched into stone that suggest counting or record-keeping. This is symbolic thinking, the ability to let one thing represent another thing, to create images and objects that carry meaning beyond their physical form. It sounds simple, but it's actually one of the most advanced mental abilities in the natural world. Most animals can't do it at all. Even our closest primate relatives only show the most basic capacity for symbolic reasoning. By 40,000 years ago, human artistic expression had become incredibly advanced. The cave paintings at Chauvet in France show animals drawn with stunning accuracy and artistic skill. Shading techniques to create three-dimensional effects. Overlapping figures to suggest movement. Use of natural rock contours to enhance the realism of the images. These aren't primitive scratches. These are the works of skilled artists who had spent years perfecting their craft, learning from other artists, developing techniques and passing them down to students. The paintings also show something else. Abstract symbols that appear repeatedly across different sites. Dots, lines, geometric shapes that clearly meant something to the people who made them. We don't know what these symbols represented: numbers, astronomical observations, territorial markers, spiritual concepts. But we know they were communicating complex ideas through visual representation. They had developed the foundations of writing thousands of years before actual written language would emerge. But perhaps the most important development was one that left almost no archaeological trace. Language. Not just simple communication. All social animals communicate. Vervet monkeys have different alarm calls for different predators. Bees perform dances to indicate the location of food sources. Even bacteria exchange chemical signals. Human language is something completely different. It's generative, recursive, capable of expressing an infinite number of ideas using a finite set of sounds. You can describe things that don't exist, events that happened in the past or might happen in the future, abstract concepts like justice, love, or the square root of -1. No other species on Earth can do this. And while we can't know exactly when fully modern language evolved, everything points to this period around 70,000 years ago as the critical moment. Think about what language makes possible. Before language, learning was limited to observation and imitation. A young human could watch an adult make a stone tool and try to copy the movements. This works for simple skills but is incredibly inefficient for complex knowledge. With language, you can explain why you're doing something. You can describe the internal logic of a process. You can warn about potential mistakes before they happen. If you strike the stone at this angle, it will shatter. You need to hit it here instead. That single sentence contains information that might take hours or days to learn through trial and error. Multiply that efficiency gain across thousands of skills, and you begin to see why language was so revolutionary. But language did something even more important. It allowed humans to share knowledge across time. Without language, every generation has to relearn everything from scratch. With language, knowledge becomes cumulative. Your grandfather figured out a better way to make fish hooks. He teaches your father. Your father teaches you. You improve the design slightly and teach your children. Over generations, the technology becomes increasingly advanced without anyone having to start from zero. This is cultural evolution, and it operates according to completely different rules than biological evolution. Biological evolution is slow. A helpful mutation might take thousands of generations to spread through a population. And if the environment changes before the mutation becomes widespread, all the evolutionary progress is wasted. Cultural evolution is fast. Someone invents a better hunting technique, and within a generation everyone in the tribe is using it. Within a few generations, neighboring tribes have learned it through trade or observation. Within a century, it spread across an entire continent. The speed difference is almost unimaginable. Biological evolution operates on time scales of thousands to millions of years. Cultural evolution can produce dramatic changes in decades or even years. A human population facing a new environmental challenge doesn't need to wait for natural selection to produce helpful mutations. They just need one clever individual to figure out a solution. And language ensures that solution spreads immediately to everyone who needs it. This is the moment when humans stopped evolving, at least in the traditional sense. Not because our genes stopped changing. They didn't. But because genetic change stopped being our main adaptation method. When the environment changed, we didn't wait for evolution to make us taller or give us thicker fur. We invented clothing. We built shelters. We controlled fire. Fire. Let's talk about fire because it's the perfect example of how culture replaced biology. Humans have been using fire for at least 400,000 years, maybe longer. But sometime around this cognitive revolution, fire use became systematic and universal. Every human group controlled fire. They could start it reliably. They could keep it going indefinitely. They understood its properties and used it for dozens of purposes. Cooking, obviously, but also heating, light, protection from predators, toolmaking, landscape management. Fire allowed humans to survive in climates that would otherwise kill them. Neanderthals in Ice Age Europe needed massive bodies and enormous metabolic rates to stay warm. Modern humans just lit fires. When modern humans moved into Europe, they didn't need hundreds of thousands of years to evolve cold weather adaptations. They wrapped themselves in animal skins and huddled around fires. Cultural adaptation in action. Clothing is another perfect example. Making fitted clothing isn't simple. You need to kill animals, remove their hides, scrape them clean, treat them to prevent rotting, cut them into patterns, and sew them together using bone needles and plant fiber or animal sinew thread. Every step requires specialized knowledge and tools. But once humans figured this out, probably around 70,000 years ago based on genetic evidence of clothing lice diverging from head lice, they could survive anywhere. Tropical Africa, Arctic Siberia, didn't matter. They just adjusted their clothing. No biological adaptation required. Compare this to every other animal on Earth. When mammals colonized different climate zones, they evolved different fur types. Polar bears have dense, water-resistant coats. Desert foxes have thin, heat-dissipating fur. This took millions of years of evolution. Humans accomplished the same thing with culture in a few thousand years. And here's the really remarkable part. Once clothing removed the selection pressure for cold weather adaptation, human bodies stopped evolving in that direction. We remained tropical animals anatomically. Tall, slender, poorly insulated. Our biology never caught up to our distribution because it didn't need to. Culture was handling the adaptation faster than biology ever could. The same pattern repeated with diet. Humans are supposed to be omnivores who eat a relatively diverse diet of fruits, vegetables, meat, nuts, whatever is available. That's what our digestive systems are optimized for. But cultural innovations allowed us to eat things we absolutely shouldn't be able to eat. Grains, for example. Raw grain is almost indigestible for humans. We lack the specialized gut bacteria that true seed eaters have. But we figured out that if you grind grain into flour and cook it, suddenly it becomes a rich source of calories. Processing through culture rather than evolution. Same with dairy. Most adult humans are lactose intolerant. That's the default state for mammals. You produce the enzyme to digest milk as an infant, then you lose that ability after weaning. Makes perfect sense from an evolutionary perspective. But around 10,000 years ago, some human populations in Africa and Europe developed animal herding. Suddenly, you've got access to cow's milk, goat's milk, sheep's milk, a rich source of calories and nutrients. The problem is most adults can't digest it. Now, in a few populations, there was a genetic mutation that allowed lactase persistence, the ability to digest lactose as an adult. This mutation did spread through natural selection because it was so advantageous. But notice what's interesting here. Humans didn't wait for the mutation. They started consuming dairy products immediately using cultural techniques. Fermentation to create yogurt and cheese, which are lower in lactose, processing and cooking methods that break down lactose. By the time the genetic adaptation appeared, humans had already culturally adapted to dairy consumption. This is the new pattern of human evolution. Culture leads. Biology follows slowly, if at all. And increasingly, biology doesn't follow at all because culture solves problems faster than natural selection can act. Humans also developed something else that completely changed how evolution worked. Complex social structures that protected weaker individuals. In most species, natural selection is brutal. Individuals with genetic disadvantages die before reproducing. That's how evolution works. The weak are removed, the strong survive, and advantageous genes spread through the population. But humans, especially after the cognitive revolution, created societies that actively protected weaker members. Someone born with poor eyesight in a wolf pack is at a severe disadvantage. They'll have trouble hunting, probably won't survive long. Someone born with poor eyesight in a human society just needs someone else to make them a spear and point them toward the prey. They can contribute in other ways. Maybe they're better at tool-making or plant processing or childcare. Archaeological evidence from this period shows individuals who survived for years despite disabilities that should have been fatal. Skeletons with severe arthritis, healed fractures, missing teeth, conditions that would have prevented them from hunting or gathering effectively on their own. They survived because their groups took care of them, fed them, protected them, kept them alive despite their disadvantages. This is compassion, yes, but it's also a massive disruption to natural selection. When you protect individuals with genetic disadvantages and help them survive to reproduce, you're preventing natural selection from removing those genes from the population. Over time, this weakens the effect of selection. Advantageous genes still spread, but disadvantageous genes no longer disappear as quickly. The human gene pool becomes more diverse because selection isn't removing variants as aggressively. And humans were fine with this because we developed another way to deal with challenges. Teaching. If someone is bad at hunting because they lack some genetic advantage, strength, speed, coordination, you can compensate by teaching them better techniques, better tools, better strategies. Cultural knowledge can overcome genetic disadvantage in ways that would be impossible for any other species. This created a feedback loop. Better cultural knowledge meant more individuals could survive and reproduce regardless of genetic fitness. More individuals surviving meant more potential innovators. More innovators meant faster cultural evolution. Faster cultural evolution meant even less pressure for biological evolution. The species that had once been shaped by brutal natural selection during the bottleneck had now created a cushion against selection pressure. They were insulating themselves from evolution. Language was the key to all of this. Language allowed the transmission of complex knowledge. Language allowed planning and coordination. Language allowed abstract reasoning and symbolic thinking. And language, unlike genes, could spread instantly. A brilliant innovation developed by one individual could be shared with their entire tribe in an afternoon, with neighboring tribes in a few weeks, across an entire continent in a generation. Compare this to biological evolution, where a helpful mutation in one individual takes thousands of years to spread through even a small population. The speed difference is millions of times faster. Literally millions. Cultural evolution operates on timescales measured in years or decades. Biological evolution operates on timescales measured in thousands or millions of years. By 50,000 years ago, humans had developed technology that was changing faster than the archaeological record could track. Every few thousand years, stone tool designs would be completely revolutionized. New materials would be incorporated. New techniques would be developed. This is orders of magnitude faster than evolutionary change, and the pace was speeding up. The period from 50,000 to 10,000 years ago saw more technological innovation than the previous 2 million years of human evolution combined. Spear throwers, bows and arrows, fishing equipment, grinding stones, pottery, boats, sleds, ropes, baskets, musical instruments. Each innovation removed another selection pressure. Each tool made humans less dependent on physical abilities and more dependent on knowledge and skill. Humans also developed complex social hierarchies and specialization. Not everyone needed to be good at everything anymore. In a hunter-gatherer band after the cognitive revolution, you might have specialists. People who are particularly skilled at tracking animals, others who excelled at tool-making, some who are experts in plant identification and processing, the best storytellers who maintained the oral history of the group, shamans or spiritual leaders who understood the symbolic and ritual aspects of life. This specialization meant the genetic advantages in one area didn't matter as much. You didn't need to be fast and strong and smart and socially skilled. You could excel in your specialty and rely on others for everything else. This is only possible with language and complex social organization. And it further reduced selection pressure because now even highly specialized individuals, those who might have severe disadvantages in some areas, could survive and thrive by focusing on their strengths. The cognitive revolution also gave humans the ability to modify their environment on an unprecedented scale. Other animals modify their environment. Beavers build dams. Termites construct elaborate mounds. But humans took environmental modification to a completely different level. They used fire to manage landscapes, burning forests to create grasslands that attracted game animals. They built complex shelters that maintained comfortable temperatures regardless of external conditions. They diverted water, created storage systems, developed preservation techniques that let them survive through seasons when food was scarce. Every environmental modification was another buffer against natural selection. When you can reshape your environment to suit your needs, you don't need to evolve to fit the environment. This is the fundamental shift that happened during the cognitive revolution. For billions of years of life on Earth, evolution shaped organisms to fit their environments. After the cognitive revolution, humans began shaping their environments to fit themselves. And once this process started, it was irreversible. There was no going back to a state where biological evolution was the main adaptation method. Cultural evolution was simply too powerful, too fast, too effective. Any population that tried to rely solely on biological adaptation would be instantly outcompeted by populations using cultural adaptation. By 40,000 years ago, when modern humans were spreading across the globe, encountering and eventually replacing Neanderthals and Denisovans, the competition wasn't really biological. Neanderthals were physically superior, stronger, more robust, better adapted to Ice Age conditions. But modern humans had superior cultural evolution, better tools, better organization, better communication. And in the competition between biology and culture won decisively. This is why human evolution effectively stopped 70,000 years ago, at least in terms of major adaptations. Not because we reached some peak of evolutionary perfection. We hadn't. We're actually pretty poorly designed in a lot of ways. Bad backs, difficult childbirth, vulnerable eyes, slow maturation. But none of that mattered anymore because we weren't adapting through evolution. We were adapting through culture. And cultural evolution is millions of times faster than biological evolution. By the time natural selection could produce a helpful genetic change, cultural innovation had already solved the problem 1,000 different ways. The species that had barely survived the bottleneck had developed the ultimate survival strategy. Not stronger bodies or faster reflexes or better camouflage. Knowledge. Transmissible, cumulative, infinitely adaptable knowledge. We had become the first species in Earth's history to evolve the ability to stop evolving, at least in the traditional sense. And that changed everything. By 15,000 years ago, modern humans had accomplished something never seen before in the history of life on Earth. They had won. Not just survived, but dominated. Every continent except Antarctica was now home to human populations. The Neanderthals were gone. The Denisovans were gone. Homo sapiens stood alone as the only human species left standing. But winning came with consequences. Consequences that would completely change the path of human evolution in ways our ancestors could never have imagined. For millions of years, human evolution had been driven by one simple, brutal method: natural selection. Individuals with traits that helped them survive and reproduce passed those traits to the next generation. Individuals without those traits died before they could have children, and their genetic variations disappeared from the gene pool. Generation after generation, this relentless process refined our species, removing weaknesses, amplifying strengths, pushing us toward better adaptation to our environments. But something changed around 70,000 years ago. Something that would eventually break the method that had shaped our species since the beginning. Modern humans began systematically removing the selection pressures that had been sculpting human evolution for millions of years. They didn't do it intentionally. They couldn't have known what was happening. But with every innovation, every social advancement, every new technology, they were removing another force that had been driving evolutionary change. It started with predators. For our primate ancestors, predation had been one of the strongest selection pressures imaginable. Faster individuals escaped leopards. Smarter individuals detected ambush predators before it was too late. More cooperative groups could defend against attacks that would overwhelm isolated individuals. Every trait that improved survival against predators got selected for. Every weakness got removed. But modern humans, armed with advanced weapons and coordinated group tactics, systematically eliminated that pressure. Cave lions that had hunted human ancestors for millions of years, extinct by 12,000 years ago. Cave bears that competed for shelter sites, gone. Saber-toothed cats that had removed the slow and weak from early human populations, disappeared. Archaeological sites from this period tell the story. Early modern human settlements show systematic hunting of the apex predators that had once hunted us. Cave bear remains with stone tool marks. Cave lion bones in refuse piles. These weren't just defensive kills. Humans were actively hunting the hunters, removing species that posed threats to their children and their communities. By 10,000 years ago, in most regions where humans lived, the only predators left were animals too small, too rare, or too wary to pose significant threats to human populations. Natural selection for traits that helped avoid predators, traits that had shaped primate evolution for 65 million years, simply stopped operating. But that was just the beginning. The real revolution came with agriculture. Around 12,000 years ago, in the Fertile Crescent, a region spanning modern-day Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, humans made a discovery that would change everything. They figured out how to plant seeds, how to grow crops, how to produce food instead of just finding it. Within a few thousand years, agriculture spread to China, Mesoamerica, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South America. Independent agricultural revolutions happening in different parts of the world, all based on the same fundamental insight. You could control your food supply. You didn't have to chase migrating herds or hope that wild plants would be abundant this year. You could plant, grow, and harvest on a predictable schedule. The implications for human evolution were staggering. For millions of years, one of the strongest selection pressures on human populations had been food scarcity. Droughts that killed entire lineages. Winters that removed everyone who couldn't store enough calories. Failed hunts that meant starvation for children who didn't have fat reserves. Year after year, generation after generation, natural selection had favored individuals who could survive famines, who could extract every possible calorie from scarce resources, who could make it through lean times when others starved. Agriculture removed most of that pressure. Not all of it. Early agricultural societies certainly faced crop failures and famines. But the baseline stability was unprecedented. Instead of feast or famine depending on whether the hunt succeeded, agricultural communities had relatively predictable food supplies. They could store grain for difficult periods. They could plan for seasonal variations. They could support larger populations in smaller territories. Most importantly, they could support individuals who wouldn't have survived as hunter-gatherers. Someone with a slight physical disability that would have been fatal in a nomadic hunting society. In an agricultural village, they could contribute by processing grain, making pottery, weaving cloth. They could survive. They could have children. Their genes stayed in the population instead of being removed by selection. The same pattern played out across every aspect of human life. Shelter used to be precarious, vulnerable to weather, predators, and environmental hazards. Natural selection favored individuals who could build better shelters, find better caves, endure exposure to cold or heat. But permanent settlements with solid structures removed much of that pressure. Almost everyone could survive winter now, not just the most cold-resistant individuals. Disease resistance had been one of the strongest selection pressures throughout human evolution. Pathogens that killed half a population before age 5 left only the genetically resistant individuals to reproduce. But as human societies developed basic sanitation, cleaner water sources, and separation of living spaces from waste, childhood mortality began to drop. Not drastically at first, but enough to matter evolutionarily. More genetic variations could survive to reproductive age. Infant mortality, the ultimate decider of evolutionary success, began to decline. For millions of years, probably half or more of all human infants died before reaching adulthood. Genetic defects, developmental abnormalities, minor health problems that became fatal, vulnerability to disease. Anything that reduced survival chances got weeded out generation after generation. But as human societies became more stable, as food became more reliable, as basic healthcare practices developed, more infants survived. Even infants with genetic variations that would have been fatal in previous generations might now survive long enough to reproduce. The selection filter that had been refining human genetics for millions of years was developing holes. More and more genetic variations could slip through. Then came something truly revolutionary, something that would prove even more important than agriculture in stopping human evolution. Humans developed social systems that cared for the weak, the sick, the injured, and the elderly. No other species does this the way humans do. Apes show some care for injured group members, but it's limited. If you can't keep up with the group, you get left behind. Wolves might bring food to an injured pack member for a few days, but chronic disability means death. Throughout the natural world, the rule is simple. If you can't contribute to your own survival, you die. Natural selection removes you before you can pass on whatever genetic variations made you vulnerable. Humans broke that rule. Archaeological evidence shows they broke it surprisingly early. Neanderthal skeletons with healed fractures that would have been disabling for months. Individuals who survived to old age despite missing teeth, with arthritis, with old injuries that never healed properly. Someone had to care for them, feed them, protect them while they recovered. But modern humans took this to unprecedented levels. By the time agricultural societies were well established, humans were systematically caring for group members who could never fully recover. The archaeological record shows individuals with severe disabilities who survived for decades. Missing limbs, congenital conditions that would have meant certain death in a hunter-gatherer society, chronic illnesses that would have been fatal without constant care. These individuals were being kept alive through their reproductive years. They were having children. Their genetic variations, which natural selection would have removed in any other species, were staying in the human gene pool. This is what scientists call relaxed selection. When environmental pressures that normally remove certain genetic variations are removed, those variations persist in the population. They don't get selected for, but they also don't get selected against. They just accumulate generation after generation, increasing genetic diversity but in ways that don't improve adaptation to the environment. By 5,000 years ago, human societies had developed to the point where relaxed selection was operating on almost every trait that had previously been under strong natural selection. Physical strength. Still useful but no longer required for survival. Most people could feed themselves through agriculture or craft specialization regardless of their strength. Speed and agility. Nice to have, but the fastest runner in the village wasn't significantly more likely to survive and reproduce than the slowest. Acute senses. Helpful for hunting, but most calories came from crops now, not from tracking prey by sound or scent. Even traits that affected mental ability were under relaxed selection. For millions of years, intelligence had been perhaps the strongest selection pressure on human evolution. Smarter individuals solved problems better, avoided dangers more effectively, secured more resources. But in increasingly complex societies with division of labor, even individuals of below-average intelligence could find roles that allowed them to survive and reproduce. They could do repetitive agricultural work, learn simple crafts, contribute to their communities in ways that hadn't existed in hunter-gatherer societies. The most dramatic change came with the development of what we now call civilization. Cities that emerged around 6,000 years ago created environments where almost any genetic variation compatible with basic survival could persist. Writing meant that knowledge didn't depend on individual memory. Legal systems provided protection regardless of physical strength. Economic specialization meant that almost everyone could contribute something valuable to society. And health care, primitive as it was, began preserving lives that would have been lost in any previous human society. Broken bones got set and splinted. Difficult childbirths received assistance from experienced midwives. Herbal remedies treated infections that would have been fatal. Not very effectively by modern standards, but enough to matter evolutionarily. With each generation, more genetic variation survived that would have been removed by natural selection in previous eras. Variations affecting vision, hearing, muscle development, metabolism, immune function, mental abilities. None of these were being actively selected against anymore because the environmental pressures that would have removed them had been removed by human culture and technology. This is fundamentally different from what was happening with other species. The gazelle with weak legs dies young, removed by predators before it can reproduce. Weak-legged genes disappear from the gazelle population. But a human with weak legs in an agricultural society, they can work in the fields, process grain, raise children. They survive. They reproduce. Their genes stay in the population. Over thousands of years, this relaxation of selection led to something unprecedented. Human populations stopped becoming more adapted to their environments through biological evolution. Not because they had reached some evolutionary optimum. Not because there were no more helpful mutations available. But because the selection pressures that would normally favor those helpful mutations and remove harmful ones had been removed. Consider lactose tolerance, the ability to digest milk as an adult. This trait evolved independently in several human populations that adopted dairy farming. It's one of the best documented examples of recent human evolution. But here's what's interesting. Lactose tolerance became common in dairy farming populations not because intolerant individuals died, but because tolerant individuals had a slight nutritional advantage. The selection pressure was weak, operating over thousands of years, affecting reproductive success rather than survival. Compare this to the selection pressures that shaped human evolution during and after the bottleneck. Starvation that killed half the population within a generation. Climate disasters that removed entire lineages. Predators that removed the weak and slow. Those were strong selection pressures, powerful enough to drive rapid evolutionary change. Lactose tolerance spreading over 8,000 years because it provided slightly better nutrition? That's relaxed selection, evolution operating at a crawl compared to the sprint that characterized earlier human evolution. By 2,000 years ago, the vast majority of humans lived in societies where survival to reproductive age was largely independent of genetic fitness. Not completely independent. Genetic disorders that prevented reproduction or caused death in infancy were still selected against. But the enormous middle range of human genetic variation was no longer under significant natural selection. In Rome, Athens, Chang'an, Teotihuacan, and dozens of other urban centers, humans with incredibly diverse genetic makeups were all surviving to reproduce at roughly similar rates. The tall and short, the strong and weak, the fast and slow, the sharp-eyed and nearsighted, all were having children, passing on their genes, contributing to the next generation. This is why scientists who study human evolution see essentially no significant biological change in human populations over the last 70,000 years. Not because helpful mutations stopped appearing. Evolution produces genetic variations constantly in every population. But because the selection pressures that would normally sort through those variations, amplifying the helpful ones and removing the harmful ones, had been removed by human culture. The development of modern medicine made this even more extreme. By the 19th century, medical advances were preserving lives that would have been lost to infections, childbirth complications, injuries, congenital conditions, any number of health issues that would have been fatal in previous eras. The 20th century brought antibiotics, surgery, vaccines, treatments for genetic disorders. Now individuals with genetic variations that would have been lethal just a few generations ago could survive to adulthood, have families, live full lives. Today, in developed nations, over 99% of people born survive to reproductive age. Think about that for a moment. 99%. In evolutionary terms, this is almost complete absence of selection. When essentially everyone reproduces regardless of their genetic variations, natural selection stops operating. The traits that get passed to the next generation are a nearly random sample of the current generation's genetics, not a selected subset of the most adaptive traits. This doesn't mean human genetics aren't changing at all. Random genetic drift still operates. Mutations still occur. In isolated populations, certain genetic variants might become more common just by chance. But directional selection, the force that pushes populations toward better adaptation to their environments, has essentially stopped operating on human populations. We preserve genetic variations that affect intelligence, physical abilities, disease resistance, sensory acuity, everything that was under strong selection pressure during our evolutionary history. Individuals with genetic variants that would have been removed by natural selection 100,000 years ago are now fully integrated into modern societies, contributing their genes to future generations. Some people worry this means humans are degenerating, accumulating harmful mutations that would have been removed by selection. But this misunderstands what's happening. We're not degenerating. We're just no longer adapting biologically to our environment because we've created an environment where biological adaptation is no longer necessary for survival. A human with poor vision doesn't need genetic changes to improve their eyesight. They need glasses. A human susceptible to infections doesn't need a genetic variant for a stronger immune system. They need antibiotics. A human who struggles with cold weather doesn't need genetic adaptations like Neanderthals developed. They need a coat and central heating. For every challenge that would have driven natural selection in the past, modern humans have developed cultural, technological, or medical solutions. And those solutions work far faster than evolution ever could. Genetic adaptations take hundreds of generations. Technological solutions can be developed in years or decades. This is the fundamental reason human evolution stopped 70,000 years ago. Not at that exact moment, of course. The process was gradual, speeding up with agriculture, urbanization, and modern technology. But the path was set during the recovery from the bottleneck, when human populations began developing the cultural complexity and technological advancement that would eventually replace biological evolution as the main means of adaptation. We became, in a very real sense, the first species in Earth's history to evolve beyond evolution, to create an environment where natural selection no longer shapes the species in significant ways, where culture and technology provide adaptive advantages far more quickly and effectively than genetic changes ever could. The implications of this are profound. It means that anatomically, genetically, biologically, modern humans are essentially frozen at the point we reached about 70,000 years ago. We're not evolving toward bigger brains or stronger bodies or better disease resistance. We're not adapting to our modern environment through genetic changes. We're simply maintaining the genetic status quo, preserving the enormous diversity of human genetics without the selective pressures that would normally shape that diversity toward any particular direction. But if strong natural selection stopped operating on human populations tens of thousands of years ago, we should see evidence of that in the fossil record. We should be able to trace the anatomical changes or lack of changes that mark the end of human biological evolution. And we can. The bones don't lie. Now, here's where things get really interesting, because when you actually look at the physical evidence, when you examine the bones and teeth and DNA of humans from the past 70,000 years, you see something that shouldn't be possible. You see stasis, evolutionary pause, a biological freeze frame that's been locked in place for 3,000 generations. Let me show you what I mean. In 2017, archaeologists working in Morocco discovered something extraordinary at a site called Jebel Irhoud. Human remains dating back 315,000 years. These weren't modern humans yet. The skulls were longer and flatter than ours. The brow ridges were more pronounced. The face projected forward more. But they were getting close. You could see modern human features starting to emerge from more archaic forms. Fast forward to 195,000 years ago, the Omo remains from Ethiopia. Even closer to modern anatomy. The skull vault is higher. The face is flatter. The brow ridges are reduced. Evolution is clearly happening. Changes are building up generation by generation. The fossil record shows human anatomy transforming steadily toward the modern form. Then jump to 160,000 years ago, the Herdo skulls, also from Ethiopia. Now we're looking at what scientists call near-modern humans. If you saw one walking down the street, you might do a double take, but you wouldn't think they were a different species. The basic architecture is there. High rounded skull, flat face, small brow ridges, prominent chin. The evolutionary path is clear. From 300,000 years ago to 100,000 years ago, human anatomy was changing rapidly. Brains were expanding. Faces were becoming more graceful. Body proportions were shifting. This is what evolution looks like in the fossil record. Steady directional change driven by natural selection. But then something weird happens around 70,000 years ago. The changes stop. Not slow down, stop. Take the Skull and Kafsa cave remains from Israel. These are anatomically modern humans who lived between 90,000 and 120,000 years ago. Their skeletons are essentially indistinguishable from people living today. Same cranial capacity, same body proportions, same dental shape, same everything. Now look at the Hofmeyr skull from South Africa, 36,000 years old. Again, completely modern. You could swap it with a skull from a contemporary South African population, and anthropologists would have trouble telling them apart without carbon dating. The Cro-Magnon remains from France, 28,000 years old. These are the famous European humans who created elaborate cave paintings and advanced tools. Their anatomy, completely modern. In fact, Cro-Magnon skeletons show slightly more robust bone structure than modern Europeans, probably because they lived more physically demanding lives. But the basic blueprint is identical to ours. Jump forward to 10,000 years ago, the Natufian people of the Middle East. Modern anatomy. 5,000 years ago, ancient Egyptians building pyramids. Modern anatomy. 2,000 years ago, Romans building their empire. Modern anatomy. You see the pattern? For the past 70,000 to 100,000 years, human bone anatomy has been remarkably stable. No major changes in skull shape. No significant shifts in body proportions. No evolution of new physical features. It's like someone pressed pause on human biological evolution right around the time our ancestors were surviving the Toba catastrophe and developing the mental abilities that would define our species. Now let's talk about brain size, because this is where the evolutionary freeze becomes even more apparent. For most of human evolution, brain size increased steadily. Homo habilis, our earliest tool-making ancestor from 2.8 million years ago, had a brain volume of about 600 cubic centimeters. Small, about 40% the size of a modern human brain. Homo erectus, who appeared 1.9 million years ago, averaged about 900 cubic centimeters. Bigger brains, more complex tools, better ability to adapt to new environments. Early Homo heidelbergensis, the common ancestor of Neanderthals and modern humans, had brains around 1,200 cubic centimeters, getting closer to modern size. By 300,000 years ago, both Neanderthal and early modern human brains were averaging 1,400 to 1,500 cubic centimeters, well within the range of contemporary humans. For over 2 million years, human brain size increased by about 850 cubic centimeters. That's massive evolutionary change. Bigger brains meant better problem solving, more complex social behavior, enhanced ability to learn and transmit culture. Natural selection was clearly favoring intelligence, and the fossil record shows steady brain expansion as a result. But then around 100,000 years ago, brain size hits a ceiling and just stops growing. Modern human brain size averages between 1,300 and 1,500 cubic centimeters. That's the same range as humans from 100,000 years ago. Same range as humans from 50,000 years ago. Same range as humans from 10,000 years ago. In fact, some studies suggest average human brain size has actually decreased slightly over the past 20,000 years. Not because we're getting less smart, but probably because we've developed such complex social structures and accumulated so much cultural knowledge that we don't need quite as much raw processing power. We can rely on collective intelligence instead of individual brain power. But even that decrease is tiny. We're talking about maybe a 10% reduction over 20,000 years, and only in some populations. The basic architecture hasn't changed at all. Compare that to the 2 million years before, when brains were doubling in size. The contrast is stark. Something fundamentally changed about human evolution around 70,000 to 100,000 years ago. The relentless pressure for bigger brains that had driven human evolution for millions of years just vanished. The bone evidence tells the same story across the board. Human height has fluctuated over the past 70,000 years, but the range of variation hasn't changed. We have short populations and tall populations today. We had short populations and tall populations 50,000 years ago. No directional change, just variation around a stable average. Dental shape, the shapes and sizes of our teeth, has remained consistent. Ancient humans had the same tooth patterns we see in modern populations. Same number of teeth, same basic shapes, same arrangement in the jaw. Limb proportions haven't changed. Humans adapted to cold climates tend to have shorter limbs and more compact body builds. Humans adapted to hot climates tend to have longer limbs and leaner builds. This pattern was established well before 70,000 years ago, and it hasn't changed since. The Inuit people of the Arctic have similar body proportions to humans who lived in cold regions 30,000 years ago. The Maasai people of East Africa have similar body proportions to humans who lived in hot regions 50,000 years ago. What's particularly striking is what hasn't evolved. Modern humans don't have any unique bone adaptations for agriculture, even though we've been farming for 10,000 years. We don't have special bone features for using tools, even though tool use has been central to human survival for millions of years. We don't have evolved anatomical features for wearing clothes, building shelters, or any of the other cultural behaviors that define human life. This is completely different from earlier human evolution. Between 2 million and 100,000 years ago, the fossil record shows dramatic anatomical changes. Homo erectus evolved longer legs for distance walking. Neanderthals evolved robust bone structures for cold climates. Early modern humans evolved more graceful builds. Every few 100,000 years, you can see clear directional changes in the fossil record. Evolution in action. But for the past 70,000 years, stasis. Now, the archaeological record tells a very different story. While human anatomy has remained stable, human culture has exploded in complexity and diversity. And this is exactly what you'd expect if cultural evolution replaced biological evolution as the main driver of human adaptation. Look at stone tool technology. From 2.6 million years ago to about 300,000 years ago, stone tool designs changed very slowly. The same basic hand axe design persisted for over 1 million years. When new tool types appeared, they spread gradually over hundreds of thousands of years. This is what you'd expect from a species where tool-making ability is largely genetic. Better toolmakers have more offspring, and over vast timescales, populations gradually evolve better tool-making abilities. But around 300,000 years ago, and especially after 70,000 years ago, the pace of technological change speeds up dramatically. New tool types appear and spread rapidly. Blade technologies, microliths, composite tools with multiple components. Innovations that once took hundreds of thousands of years to develop and spread now appear and spread in a few thousand years. By 40,000 years ago, human technology is changing so fast that archaeologists can date sites by their tool collections. Each few thousand years brings recognizably different tool styles. This is cultural evolution, ideas spreading through learning and imitation, not genes. The same pattern appears in art. The earliest definite art, ochre engravings from South Africa, dates to about 100,000 years ago. By 40,000 years ago, humans are creating elaborate cave paintings, carved figurines, musical instruments, and personal ornaments. This artistic explosion happens without any changes in human anatomy. Same brain size, same hands, same eyes, but radically different cultural expressions. Or look at food-getting strategies. Humans 50,000 years ago were hunter-gatherers using a wide range of plant and animal resources. Humans 10,000 years ago were beginning to domesticate plants and animals, transitioning to agriculture. Humans 5,000 years ago were living in cities with specialized jobs and complex trade networks. Each of these transitions represents a massive change in how humans obtain food and organize their societies. But none of them required biological evolution. The humans who built the first cities had the same anatomy as the hunter-gatherers who lived 40,000 years earlier. What changed was culture, not biology. This is the mark of a species that has escaped normal evolutionary constraints. Physical adaptation through genetic change takes hundreds of thousands of years. Cultural adaptation through learning and innovation can happen in a few generations. Once humans crossed that threshold, once we developed the mental and language abilities to create and transmit complex culture, biological evolution became largely irrelevant to our survival. The ancient DNA evidence confirms this pattern with remarkable precision. In 2010, scientists published the first draft of the Neanderthal genome, assembled from DNA extracted from 40,000-year-old bones. This was revolutionary. For the first time, we could compare the actual genetic code of an extinct human species with that of modern humans. The results showed that modern non-African populations carry about 2% Neanderthal DNA. This DNA comes from interbreeding events that happened between 50,000 and 60,000 years ago, when modern humans first left Africa and encountered Neanderthal populations in the Middle East. But here's what's remarkable: that Neanderthal DNA has barely changed in 50,000 years. The same genetic sequences that interbred into modern human populations back then are still present in living people today. They haven't evolved into something new. They haven't been removed by natural selection. They're just sitting there in our genomes, functionally identical to how they were 50,000 years ago. Some of those Neanderthal gene variants affect things like immune function and skin color. The fact that they've persisted for 50,000 years without significant change tells us that evolution in modern humans has been weak at best. If strong natural selection were operating, we'd expect those genes to have either swept to fixation, everyone having them, or been removed entirely. Instead, they've just drifted along at stable frequencies for hundreds of generations. The same pattern appears with Denisovan DNA. Modern Asian and Pacific Islander populations carry Denisovan genetic variants that interbred into our ancestors between 40,000 and 50,000 years ago. Again, minimal change over thousands of generations. The DNA from interbreeding events that happened when humans still used stone tools is nearly identical to the versions present in modern populations. Even more striking are the studies of ancient human DNA from our own species. Scientists have now sequenced DNA from human remains spanning the past 45,000 years. Hunter-gatherers from Ice Age Europe, early farmers from the Middle East, ancient steppe pastoralists from Central Asia. What they found is remarkable genetic continuity. In 2014, researchers published the genome of a 45,000-year-old modern human from Siberia. His DNA showed he was part of a population that contributed ancestry to both European and Asian populations. Genetically, he was essentially a modern human, not an archaic form that would later evolve into something else. A modern human who lived 45,000 years ago and whose genome would fit comfortably within present-day human genetic diversity. A 2016 study sequenced DNA from 14 ancient hunter-gatherers who lived in Europe between 35,000 and 7,000 years ago. These people lived through the Ice Age, witnessed the extinction of Neanderthals, and developed some of the most advanced stone tool technologies in human prehistory. Their DNA revealed continuous genetic ancestry linking them directly to present-day Europeans. No major evolutionary changes. No emergence of new genetic variants that would indicate strong natural selection. Just gradual mixing and migration of populations that were already genetically modern. What's particularly telling is what these ancient genomes don't show. They don't show evidence of recent brain size increases. They don't show ongoing selection for mental abilities. They don't show evolution of new metabolic adaptations or immune functions beyond a few very specific cases we'll discuss later. Instead, they show humans who were already genetically modern 40,000 years ago, living as hunter-gatherers, and whose descendants would go on to invent agriculture, build civilizations, and develop written language without any significant biological changes. You can trace specific human lineages back through these ancient genomes with remarkable precision. The San people of southern Africa, for example, represent one of the deepest branches of the human family tree. Genetic analysis suggests they diverged from other human populations around 100,000 to 150,000 years ago. Yet their DNA is clearly modern human. The genetic distance between a San person and a Norwegian person is tiny compared to the genetic distance between a chimpanzee and a bonobo, two species that diverged about 1 to 2 million years ago. This tells us that all living humans share a very recent common ancestry, and that our lineages have undergone minimal evolutionary divergence since they split. We're all variants of the same basic genetic template that was established before 70,000 years ago. The contrast with earlier human evolution couldn't be more dramatic. Between 2 million and 300,000 years ago, human evolution was rapid and directional. Every few 100,000 years, you see new species appearing: Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, Neanderthals, Denisovans, early modern humans, each with distinct anatomical features, each adapted to specific environments, each representing a clear evolutionary split from their ancestors. The fossil record from this period shows dramatic changes in skull shape, brain size, body proportions, and dental shape. If you compared a Homo erectus skeleton from 1.5 million years ago with a Homo heidelbergensis skeleton from 500,000 years ago, the differences would be obvious even to a casual observer. Different species clearly evolving along different paths. But compare a modern human skeleton from 70,000 years ago with one from today, and you'd struggle to find meaningful differences. Same species, same anatomy, same basic genetic blueprint. The evolutionary path hasn't just slowed, it's effectively stopped. This biological stasis coincides almost exactly with the emergence of behavioral modernity, the full package of mental and cultural abilities that define our species. Symbolic thinking, complex language, technological innovation, social cooperation at scale. Once humans developed these abilities, once we could adapt to new challenges through culture rather than through genetic change, the old rules of evolution stopped applying. We didn't need to evolve bigger brains to become smarter. We could just learn more and develop better educational systems. We didn't need to evolve physical adaptations to cold climates. We could just invent better clothing and shelter. We didn't need to evolve specialized digestive systems to exploit new food sources. We could just invent cooking and food processing. The fossil record doesn't lie. For the past 70,000 years, human anatomy has been stable. Our brains haven't grown. Our skeletons haven't changed. Our DNA has accumulated only minor variations. We are physically and genetically the same species as the people who survived Toba, who painted caves in France, who first planted crops in the Fertile Crescent. What's changed isn't our biology. It's everything else. And that's exactly what you'd expect from a species that traded evolution for culture, survival of the fittest for survival of the most innovative. The fossil record shows us frozen in biological time, while the archaeological record shows us exploding in cultural complexity. We stopped evolving physically because we learned to evolve culturally instead. And that change, that shift from biological to cultural adaptation, happened right around 70,000 years ago. Right when everything else in the human story was transforming. Right when we became, for better or worse, the species we still are today. Now, if you've been paying attention, you might be thinking, wait a minute, humans haven't stopped evolving at all. What about lactose tolerance? What about high-altitude adaptations? What about all those documented genetic changes that have happened in just the last few thousand years? Fair question, because yes, human evolution has continued. Genes are still mutating. Natural selection is still happening. Some populations have developed new traits that help them survive in specific environments. But here's the thing, and this is crucial to understanding what really changed 70,000 years ago. These recent evolutionary changes are fundamentally different from the transformations that came before. They're not making us more human. They're just making us slightly better adapted to particular circumstances. Think of it like this. Before 70,000 years ago, human evolution was writing the operating system, installing the hardware, building the machine from scratch. After 70,000 years ago, evolution has just been tweaking settings, installing minor software updates, adjusting configurations for different users. The basic platform hasn't changed. Let's start with probably the most famous recent evolutionary change: lactose tolerance. For millions of years, every mammal on Earth followed the same pattern. As infants, they could digest milk because they produced an enzyme called lactase that breaks down lactose, the sugar in milk. Then sometime after weaning, lactase production shut down. Adult mammals couldn't digest milk. There was no evolutionary reason to maintain that ability once you stopped nursing. Then about 10,000 years ago, something unprecedented happened. Humans in several parts of the world domesticated cattle, goats, and sheep. Suddenly, there was this massive source of nutrition available, liquid calories that could sustain you through winters and droughts. But there was a problem. Adult humans couldn't digest it. Drinking milk as an adult caused bloating, cramping, diarrhea. Not exactly the survival advantage you're looking for. But in every population that kept dairy animals, a genetic mutation began spreading. A simple change in the DNA that kept lactase production turned on into adulthood. Suddenly, individuals with this mutation could drink milk without getting sick. They had access to a reliable food source that their neighbors couldn't fully use. The survival and reproductive advantage was enormous. In Northern Europe, where dairy farming became central to the economy, lactose tolerance spread like wildfire through the population. Today, more than 90% of people in Scandinavia can digest milk as adults. In East Africa, where cattle herding became a way of life, similar mutations appeared independently, different genetic changes producing the same result: continued lactase production into adulthood. The speed of this evolutionary change is actually remarkable. In just 300 generations, lactose tolerance went from a rare mutation to the dominant trait in some populations. That's evolution in fast forward. Natural selection doing exactly what it's supposed to do, favoring traits that improve survival and reproduction. But notice what didn't change. Lactose tolerance didn't make humans smarter. It didn't alter our brain structure or increase our capacity for abstract reasoning. It didn't change how we walk or how we communicate or how we process information. It just allowed some populations to digest a specific food that other populations still can't handle. It's a metabolic adjustment, not a fundamental transformation of what it means to be human. Compare that to the changes that happened before the bottleneck. The development of fire control that required completely new mental abilities. The explosion in brain size that transformed human intelligence. The evolution of bipedalism that restructured our entire skeleton and freed our hands for tool use. Those were operating system upgrades. Lactose tolerance is more like enabling dark mode, useful under certain conditions, but not a game changer for the species. The same pattern shows up in high-altitude adaptations. Some of the clearest examples of recent human evolution come from populations living at extreme elevations, the Tibetan Plateau and the Andes Mountains. Both regions sit above 12,000 feet where the air contains about 40% less oxygen than at sea level. For most humans, spending extended time at these altitudes is brutal. Your body struggles to get enough oxygen. You develop altitude sickness, headaches, nausea, fatigue. Your blood thickens as your body desperately produces more red blood cells to carry oxygen. This thickening can lead to serious health problems. Increased risk of stroke, heart attack, blood clots. But populations that have lived at high altitudes for thousands of years have evolved specific adaptations that help them function normally in thin air. Tibetans, whose ancestors moved to the plateau about 30,000 years ago, developed genetic variants that prevent their blood from thickening excessively at altitude. Instead of producing more red blood cells like lowlanders do, Tibetans maintain relatively normal red blood cell counts but process oxygen more efficiently at the cellular level. The genetic changes responsible for this adaptation have been identified. Variants in genes called EPAS1 and EGLN1 that regulate how the body responds to low oxygen conditions. These variants are found in more than 80% of Tibetans but are extremely rare in lowland populations. Even more remarkably, the EPAS1 variant appears to have come from Denisovans. Remember them? Those long-extinct human cousins who interbred with our ancestors. Genetic analysis shows that modern Tibetans inherited this high-altitude adaptation from Denisovan populations that lived in the region tens of thousands of years ago. It was already evolved, already tested, already proven effective. Modern Tibetans just inherited a survival tool that another human species had developed long before. Andean populations in South America developed different solutions to the same problem. They've been living at high altitudes for at least 10,000 years, and they've evolved their own set of adaptations. Unlike Tibetans, Andean highlanders do produce more red blood cells, but they've also developed larger lung capacities and more efficient oxygen delivery systems that prevent the dangerous side effects of thickened blood. The genetic basis for these adaptations is still being studied, but it's clear they represent independent evolutionary responses to the same environmental challenge. Two different populations, two different genetic solutions, same basic problem. This is natural selection doing its job. But again, look at what actually changed. The ability to process oxygen slightly differently. Modifications to blood chemistry and lung capacity. Tweaks to existing systems rather than development of entirely new capabilities. These adaptations don't expand human mental abilities. They don't create new forms of communication or novel types of social organization. They just make it possible for people to live in specific environments that would otherwise be unhealthy. A Tibetan Highlander and a sea level dweller have essentially identical brains, identical mental abilities, identical capacity for language, abstract reasoning, technological innovation. The differences are entirely body function adjustments to how the body delivers oxygen to tissues, important for survival at altitude, completely irrelevant for the fundamental question of human evolution. Then there are the disease resistance adaptations. Some of the most powerful recent selection pressures on human populations have come from infectious diseases, and these pressures have left clear genetic marks. The most famous example is the sickle cell trait in populations from regions where malaria is common. Malaria, caused by Plasmodium parasites transmitted by mosquitoes, has been one of the deadliest diseases in human history. It's killed more people than probably any other infectious disease. Billions have died from malaria over the millennia. In regions where malaria is common, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, a genetic mutation affecting hemoglobin, the oxygen-carrying molecule in blood, provides partial protection. People who inherit one copy of the sickle cell gene from one parent and a normal gene from the other parent have enough altered hemoglobin to make it harder for malaria parasites to reproduce in their blood cells. They're significantly less likely to die from malaria. The downside is that people who inherit the sickle cell gene from both parents develop sickle cell disease, a serious condition where red blood cells become misshapen and can block blood vessels. But in evolutionary terms, the trade-off makes sense. In regions with high malaria rates, having one copy of the sickle cell gene provides a survival advantage that outweighs the risk that some offspring will inherit two copies and develop the disease. Natural selection has maintained this gene at relatively high frequencies in affected populations, and it's been doing so for thousands of years. Similar patterns show up with other diseases. Populations from regions where tuberculosis has been common show evidence of selection for genetic variants that provide some resistance. European populations that survived multiple plague outbreaks carry genes that may have helped their ancestors survive exposure to Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes plague. In each case, we see evolution responding to environmental pressures, diseases in this case rather than altitude or diet. Genetic variants that provide survival advantages spread through populations. Those that don't get weeded out. This is natural selection operating exactly as Darwin described it. But once again, notice the scale of these changes. They're modifications to immune system function or blood chemistry, important for survival in specific disease environments, but they don't alter the fundamental nature of human thinking, communication, or abilities. A person with sickle cell trait and a person without it have identical brains, identical capacity for language and abstract reasoning, identical ability to learn, create, and innovate. The genetic difference matters for malaria resistance. It doesn't matter for anything that makes us distinctly human. Then there's skin color, often cited as evidence of recent human evolution. And rightfully so. The variation in human skin pigmentation is one of the most visible examples of adaptation to different environments. Our earliest human ancestors in Africa had dark skin, heavy melanin pigmentation that protected against intense tropical UV radiation. Melanin acts like natural sunscreen, preventing UV rays from breaking down folate, a vitamin that's essential for DNA synthesis and reproduction. In environments with strong year-round sunlight, dark skin is a survival advantage. But when modern human populations began moving into higher latitudes, particularly into Europe and Northern Asia, they encountered a different problem. Less sunlight. UV radiation is necessary for the body to produce vitamin D. In tropical regions, even with dark skin blocking some UV, there's enough sunlight to produce adequate vitamin D. But in northern regions, especially during winter months, sunlight is scarce. Too much melanin, and you can't produce enough vitamin D. Vitamin D deficiency causes rickets, weakened bones, increased mortality. For populations moving into northern latitudes, dark skin became a disadvantage. Natural selection responded predictably. Genetic variants that reduced melanin production began spreading through northern populations. Lighter skin allowed more UV penetration, more vitamin D production, better health outcomes. Over thousands of years, populations at different latitudes evolved different levels of skin pigmentation, perfectly balanced to match UV protection against vitamin D production for their specific environments. The genetic changes responsible for skin color variation have been identified. Multiple genes affecting melanin production, different combinations of variants producing the spectrum of human skin colors we see today. Some of these genetic changes are remarkably recent. Light skin in Europeans appears to have evolved primarily within the last 8,000 years, driven partly by the shift to agriculture and grain-based diets that reduce dietary vitamin D intake. Once again, this is evolution in action. Environmental pressures, genetic variation, natural selection, adaptation, all the pieces working exactly as evolutionary theory predicts. But also, once again, consider what actually changed. Melanin production levels, the amount of pigment in skin cells. This affects UV protection and vitamin D synthesis, critically important for health in different environments, completely unrelated to mental function. A person with very dark skin and a person with very light skin have identical brains, identical language abilities, identical capacity for abstract reasoning, technological innovation, cultural transmission. The difference is literally skin deep, a surface adaptation to different UV environments, not a fundamental change in what makes us human. Are you seeing the pattern? Every example of recent human evolution follows the same basic structure: environmental pressure, genetic variation, natural selection, adaptation. But the adaptations are always surface level. They're adjustments to diet, altitude, disease, or UV exposure. They never touch the core elements that defined human evolution before 70,000 years ago. Nobody has evolved bigger brains in the last 10,000 years. No population has developed enhanced mental abilities that other populations lack. No group has evolved new forms of communication or novel types of social organization through biological changes. The operating system installed during and after the bottleneck remains unchanged. What has changed are the settings, the minor configurations that help different populations run the same basic human software in different environmental conditions. And here's what makes this really striking. We can actually measure how fast evolution was happening before versus after the major transitions. Before the bottleneck, during those millions of years of human evolution, brain size increased by about 400%. From Australopithecus with brains around 400 cubic centimeters to Homo sapiens with brains averaging 1,400 cubic centimeters. That's a massive transformation. Body structure changed completely. Ape-like proportions with long arms and short legs gave way to modern human proportions optimized for long-distance walking and running. Tool use went from non-existent to advanced stone tool industries requiring years of learning to master. These weren't small adjustments. They were fundamental transformations that created an entirely new type of organism. And they happened gradually over millions of years, driven by intense natural selection pressures. Then came the bottleneck and the cognitive revolution, and suddenly the pace of major evolutionary change dropped off dramatically. Brain size actually decreased slightly over the last 20,000 years. We have somewhat smaller brains than our ancestors did. Body structure has remained essentially unchanged. We're slightly taller on average due to better nutrition, but our skeletons are fundamentally identical to those of humans from 50,000 years ago. The changes that have occurred, lactose tolerance, altitude adaptations, disease resistance, skin color variation, all happen much faster than the earlier major transitions. A few thousand years instead of hundreds of thousands or millions. But they're also trivial in comparison. Metabolic adjustments rather than the creation of new abilities. This actually proves the central argument. Evolution hasn't stopped. The methods are still operating. Genes still mutate. Natural selection still favors traits that improve survival and reproduction. Populations still adapt to their environments. But the targets of evolution have completely changed. Before 70,000 years ago, evolution was working on the hardware, building bigger brains, restructuring bodies, creating the biological foundations for complex thinking. After 70,000 years ago, evolution has been working on the accessories, adjusting digestive systems, fine-tuning oxygen processing, modifying immune responses. The core machine is no longer being upgraded. Some researchers argue this actually represents a fundamental shift in how evolution operates in humans. They call it the shift from biological evolution to cultural evolution. The idea is that once humans developed sufficient mental abilities and cultural transmission, we began adapting primarily through learned behaviors rather than genetic changes. Need to survive in cold climates? Pre-70,000 years ago, you'd evolve body-cold adaptations over hundreds of thousands of years, thicker body hair, more efficient metabolism, changes in body proportions. Post-70,000 years ago, you invent tailored clothing and learn to build insulated shelters. You adapt culturally in a single generation rather than biologically over thousands of years. Need to exploit new food sources? Pre-70,000 years ago, you'd evolve digestive adaptations over vast timescales. Post-70,000 years ago, you develop cooking techniques and food processing methods that make new foods digestible without genetic changes. Need to compete with other species? Pre-70,000 years ago, you'd evolve physical advantages. Bigger bodies, stronger muscles, better weapons. Post-70,000 years ago, you develop better tools and hunting strategies that make physical advantages irrelevant. Once culture could evolve faster than genes, biological evolution became largely unnecessary for survival in new environments. We had developed a cheat code for adaptation, the ability to learn from others and transmit complex knowledge across generations, which meant we could adapt to virtually any environment without waiting for natural selection to modify our genes. This is why the recent evolutionary changes are so revealing. They're happening in areas where culture can't easily compensate. You can't learn your way to lactose tolerance. Either your genes allow you to digest milk or they don't. You can't teach your body to function better at high altitude. Body adaptations are required. You can't study your way to malaria resistance. Genetic changes in blood chemistry are necessary. These are the gaps where biological evolution is still operating, the spaces where cultural adaptation can't fully substitute for genetic change. And even in these areas, the evolutionary changes are modest, fine-tuning existing systems rather than creating fundamentally new abilities. This contrasts sharply with the evolutionary changes that happened before cultural transmission became advanced enough to carry the adaptive burden. Those earlier changes, the tripling of brain size, the complete restructuring of the body for bipedalism, the development of the neural circuitry for complex language, those couldn't be shortcut by culture because they were the changes that made culture possible. You can't have advanced cultural transmission without first evolving the brain structures that enable it. You can't develop complex technologies without first evolving the mental abilities to conceive of and learn complicated skills. You can't build large cooperative societies without first evolving the social intelligence to navigate complex relationships. The hardware had to be built before the software could run. And the bottleneck 70,000 years ago essentially completed that hardware installation. What we're left with is a species that's still evolving in minor ways but has stopped evolving in major ones. The recent changes, as real and as documented as they are operating on a completely different scale than the changes that created humanity in the first place. A Tibetan's altitude adaptation doesn't make them more human. A Northern European's lactose tolerance doesn't expand their humanity. An African's sickle cell trait doesn't add new dimensions to human consciousness. These are footnotes to human evolution. The main story was written hundreds of thousands of years ago, ending in the cognitive revolution that followed the bottleneck. Everything since then has been minor revisions, important to the individuals and populations affected, but trivial in the larger context of what makes humans unique among Earth's species. The exceptions that prove the rule. Evolution continues, but the age of major human evolution ended 70,000 years ago. What came before built the human machine? What came after just adjusted settings for local conditions? The difference isn't subtle. It's the difference between writing a book and fixing typos, between building a house and choosing paint colors, between creating a species and fine-tuning its details. Humans stopped evolving in the ways that matter. We're still evolving in the ways that don't. So here we are, the last human species standing. The descendants of those survivors who nearly went extinct 74,000 years ago. For hundreds of thousands of years after that bottleneck, we evolved rapidly. We developed larger brains, advanced language, technological innovation, the capacity for abstract thought. We spread across the entire planet, adapting to every environment from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforests. We outlasted Neanderthals, Denisovans, and every other human species that shared our ancestry. But then something remarkable happened. Something that had never occurred in the entire history of life on Earth. We stopped evolving. Or more precisely, evolution stopped being the main force shaping humanity. That transition happened roughly 70,000 years ago, right around the time modern humans began their final expansion out of Africa. And understanding why and how it happened tells us everything about what it means to be human in the modern world. The shift wasn't sudden. It wasn't like someone flipped a switch and human evolution just ended. It was gradual, the result of cultural evolution finally overtaking biological evolution as the main force in human development. For millions of years, our ancestors had adapted to their environments the old-fashioned way, through natural selection. If the climate got colder, populations that happened to have genes for stockier builds or better fat storage survived better. Over thousands of generations, those traits became more common. That's how Neanderthals developed their robust bodies and large nasal passages. That's how Denisovans adapted to high altitudes and maritime environments. Pure Darwinian evolution. But modern humans had stumbled onto something that changed the rules entirely. We learned to adapt faster than our genes could change. The climate gets colder? Don't wait 10,000 years for natural selection to give you a stockier build. Just invent better clothing. Build better shelters. Learn to control fire more effectively. Food sources disappear? Don't wait for your digestive system to evolve new abilities. Develop new hunting techniques. Try different foods. Invent tools that let you process what you couldn't eat before. This is the cognitive revolution that archaeologists talk about. Not a genetic change, though genes certainly enabled it, but a cultural shift that happened at lightning speed compared to biological evolution. Around 70,000 years ago, modern humans developed what researchers call behavioral modernity. The full package of symbolic thinking, complex language, advanced toolmaking, and most importantly, the ability to share knowledge rapidly across groups and generations. Suddenly, a useful innovation didn't need to spread through genetic inheritance over thousands of years. It could spread through learning in a single generation. A clever individual figures out how to make a better spear point. They teach it to their children and their neighbors. Within a few decades, everyone in the region is using the improved design. That's cultural evolution, and it operates on a completely different timescale than biological evolution. The archaeological record shows this speed up clearly. For millions of years, stone tool designs changed glacially slowly. Hand axes from 1.5 million years ago look essentially identical to hand axes from 500,000 years ago. But after 70,000 years ago, tool designs start changing rapidly. New innovations appear every few thousand years, then every few hundred years. By 20,000 years ago, different human groups separated by just a few hundred miles are using completely different tool technologies, each adapted to their specific local conditions. This cultural adaptability meant that natural selection pressures that had shaped our ancestors for millions of years suddenly became much weaker. The ones who survived weren't necessarily the strongest or the ones with the best cold weather adaptations or the most efficient digestive systems. The survivors were the ones who could learn fastest, who could teach most effectively, who could build up and share knowledge within their groups. And that brings us to the big question. If human evolution essentially stopped 70,000 years ago, does that mean we're done evolving? Are we going to look exactly the same in another 100,000 years? The answer is complicated because human evolution hasn't actually stopped. It's just slowed down to the point where it's barely noticeable compared to cultural change. And what evolution is selecting for has changed dramatically. Let's look at what's actually happened to human genetics over the last 70,000 years. We have gotten a few changes, and they're revealing. The most obvious ones are surface adaptations to different environments. Skin color variations that help different populations manage sunlight exposure. Lighter skin in northern latitudes to maximize vitamin D production from weak sunlight. Darker skin near the equator to protect against UV damage. Body proportions that help with temperature control. Lankier builds in hot climates, stockier builds in cold ones. But notice what these changes have in common. They're all minor tweaks to the existing human template. surface-level adaptations that don't fundamentally change what we are. Our brains haven't gotten significantly larger or more complex. Our basic anatomy hasn't changed. Our mental abilities remain essentially identical to humans who lived 70,000 years ago. If you could raise a baby from that era in a modern family, they'd be indistinguishable from any other child. Same intelligence, same capacity for language, same potential for learning. The most significant evolutionary changes have been in traits that help us digest new foods introduced by agriculture. Lactose tolerance, the ability to digest milk into adulthood, evolved independently in several populations that domesticated dairy animals. Some populations developed better ability to process starches from cultivated grains. Others adapted to high-altitude environments or developed resistance to specific diseases. But these are exceptions that prove the rule. They're responses to dramatic environmental changes like the invention of agriculture or migration to extreme altitudes, and even then they're minor adjustments. Nothing like the major transformations that characterized earlier human evolution. No one's developing bigger brains or fundamentally new abilities. We're just tweaking the existing system. The reason is simple. Cultural adaptation is so much faster than biological evolution that genetic changes rarely have time to provide significant advantages anymore. By the time natural selection could favor a genetic mutation that helps you survive in a new environment, humans have already invented cultural solutions that work for everyone. You don't need genes for cold tolerance if you have clothing and heated shelters. You don't need genetic adaptations to new food sources if you have cooking techniques that make almost anything edible. So in a very real sense, humans stopped evolving in any meaningful way around 70,000 years ago. We reached a configuration that was good enough, flexible enough that we could handle almost any challenge through culture and technology rather than genetic change. We became evolutionarily frozen, not because we reached some perfect state, but because we developed tools that made further evolution largely unnecessary. But now we're living with the consequences of that evolutionary pause. Because here's the thing that most people don't realize. We're walking around in bodies and brains that were designed for a world that no longer exists. Our biology was optimized for the challenges our ancestors faced during and immediately after the genetic bottleneck. Small hunter-gatherer groups, constant movement, variable food availability, significant physical danger, close-knit social networks of maybe 150 people maximum. That world is gone. But our bodies haven't gotten the message. This is what scientists call evolutionary mismatch. And it explains an enormous amount about modern human health and behavior problems. Think about obesity. In the world our ancestors evolved for, calories were scarce and unpredictable. Finding a concentrated source of fats and sugars, like honey or ripe fruit, was a rare opportunity. Natural selection strongly favored people who would eat lots of those foods when they found them, storing as much energy as possible as body fat for lean times. That made perfect sense 70,000 years ago. Today, when concentrated fats and sugars are available 24/7 at every corner store, that same genetic programming is killing us. Our bodies still behave like starvation is always just around the corner. We crave calorie-dense foods. We struggle to stop eating when food is abundant. We store fat very efficiently. These were survival advantages in the Ice Age. They're health disasters in modern industrial societies. The same applies to our stress responses. Our ancestors faced immediate physical dangers. Predators, hostile neighbors, environmental hazards that required instant fight-or-flight reactions. Your body's stress system, the flood of hormones and body changes that happen when you feel threatened, evolved for those kinds of challenges, short-term acute stresses that you could resolve through physical action. But modern stress is completely different. Job insecurity, financial problems, social media anxiety. These are chronic psychological stresses that our stress response system wasn't designed to handle. You can't fight your mortgage or run away from your student loans. So your body stays in a state of elevated stress, pumping out cortisol and adrenaline for problems that physical action can't solve. The result: heart disease, anxiety disorders, depression, weakened immune function. Your Ice Age survival system trying to cope with 21st century problems. Or consider our social instincts. Humans evolved in small groups where everyone knew everyone. Your survival depended on maintaining good relationships with maybe 150 people, and you'd probably know most of them for your entire life. Natural selection favored people who were good at reading social cues, forming strong bonds, maintaining their reputation within the group. We became extraordinarily sensitive to social acceptance and rejection because in a small hunter-gatherer band, being cast out could literally be a death sentence. Fast forward to today. We live in cities with millions of people. We interact with hundreds of strangers daily. We're connected to thousands of people through social media, and our Ice Age brains are completely overwhelmed. We experience social anxiety because our threat detection systems treat a room full of strangers like a potentially dangerous situation. We obsess over our online image because our reputation management instincts can't distinguish between our actual social group and the thousands of people who might see our posts. We feel lonely despite being more connected than ever because our bonding methods were calibrated for small stable groups, not vast fluid social networks. Even our sleep patterns are mismatched to modern life. Our ancestors lived by natural light cycles. They didn't have electric lights keeping them awake long after sunset. They didn't have smartphones flooding their brains with blue light that stops melatonin production. Their activity patterns followed the sun. Today we work night shifts, scroll through screens until midnight, expose ourselves to artificial light at all hours, and wonder why we have widespread levels of sleep disorders. Our circadian rhythms are still running on Ice Age programming. The mismatch extends to our thinking biases, too. Humans are terrible at assessing statistical risk. We overestimate the danger of rare but dramatic threats like terrorism or plane crashes, while underestimating common but mundane risks like heart disease or car accidents. Why? Because our risk assessment systems evolved in an environment where dramatic immediate threats, predator attacks, violence from other groups were the main things that could kill you. Your ancestors who were paranoid about sudden dangers survived better than those who were careless about them. But in the modern world, where the biggest threats to your health are chronic and statistical, those same instincts lead us astray. We're also terrible at thinking long-term. We discount future consequences heavily in favor of immediate rewards. This made sense when the future was so uncertain that worrying about it was often pointless. When you might not survive the winter, planning for your retirement decades from now would be absurd. But today, when most people in developed countries can expect to live 70 or 80 years, our inability to prioritize long-term consequences over short-term pleasure causes enormous problems. Climate change, retirement savings, public health. Every major challenge we face requires thinking decades ahead. And our Ice Age brains really struggle with that. So what does all this mean for the future of human evolution? Will we ever change significantly again? Or are we permanently locked into our current form? The honest answer is that we don't know. But we can make some educated guesses based on what we understand about evolution and the forces currently shaping humanity. Traditional natural selection has become almost irrelevant for humans in developed countries. Modern medicine means that genetic variations that would have been fatal a few hundred years ago no longer prevent people from surviving and reproducing. Poor eyesight, diabetes, heart conditions, countless other genetic issues that natural selection would have weeded out are now managed with glasses, insulin, medications. We've essentially opted out of survival of the fittest. Almost everyone survives. Almost everyone can reproduce if they choose to. This doesn't mean human genetics aren't changing at all. There's still selection happening, but it's based on different factors than in our evolutionary past. Reproductive success, how many children people have, varies based on cultural, economic, and personal factors that have nothing to do with genetic fitness in the traditional sense. In some populations, people with certain personality traits or socioeconomic backgrounds have more children. In others, different factors drive birth rates. Over thousands of generations, this could lead to genetic changes, but they'd be driven by modern social conditions, not environmental pressures. There's also the possibility of new selection pressures emerging. Climate change could create environmental challenges that favor certain genetic variants. Novel diseases might select for specific immune system genes. Migration and population mixing continue to shuffle genetic variation in new ways. But any of these changes would take thousands or tens of thousands of years to produce noticeable results. Cultural adaptation will almost certainly outpace them. The real wild card is technology. For the first time in the history of life on Earth, A species has the potential to take control of its own evolution. We're not there yet, but the pieces are falling into place. We can read the entire human genome. We can edit genes with increasing precision. We're beginning to understand the genetic basis of complex traits like intelligence, personality, disease resistance. Within a few decades, maybe a century at most, humans will face a choice that no species has ever confronted. Do we start designing our own descendants? Do we edit human embryos to remove genetic diseases? To enhance intelligence or physical abilities? To adapt ourselves to new environments like other planets? This isn't science fiction. The technology for basic genetic modifications already exists. The question isn't if we'll have the capability, but whether we'll choose to use it and how. This potential for genetic engineering represents a completely different kind of evolution. Not natural selection operating blindly over millions of years, but conscious directed changes happening in single generations. It would be incredibly powerful and incredibly dangerous. We could remove genetic diseases that have caused immeasurable suffering. We could also create unforeseen problems, widen inequality, or change what it means to be human in ways we can't predict. Some scientists think we'll merge with our technology even more directly. Brain-computer interfaces that enhance our mental abilities, artificial organs that outperform natural ones, nanomachines that repair cellular damage and extend lifespan indefinitely. At some point, the line between biological human and cybernetic human becomes blurry. Are we still the same species if 30% of our brain is computer chips? If we've replaced our organs with artificial ones? If we've edited so many genes that we're genetically distinct from our ancestors? Others think artificial intelligence will make human evolution irrelevant entirely. If we create machines that are more intelligent than us, they might become the dominant form of intelligence on Earth, with biological humans either merging with them or becoming obsolete. This is speculative, obviously, but it's worth considering that evolution might not be finished with intelligence on Earth. It might just be shifting to a non-biological form. Let's bring this back to what's practical and knowable. For the foreseeable future, certainly for the next 1,000 years and probably much longer, humans are going to remain basically the same biologically. We'll continue to be Ice Age hunter-gatherers living in a world we've transformed beyond recognition. We'll continue to struggle with the mismatch between our evolved instincts and our modern environment. And understanding that mismatch is actually incredibly valuable. When you know that your cravings for sugar and fat are evolutionary hangovers from a time when calories were scarce, it becomes easier to make conscious choices about diet. When you understand that your social anxiety is your Ice Age threat detection system misfiring, you can work with it more effectively. When you recognize that your brain's terrible at long-term planning because your ancestors rarely lived long enough for it to matter, you can build systems and habits that compensate for that weakness. We can't change our evolutionary heritage. We're stuck with these Ice Age bodies and brains. But we can understand them. And understanding is power. We can design our environments, our social systems, our technologies in ways that work with our nature rather than against it. We can acknowledge that we're evolutionarily mismatched to modern life and make conscious efforts to address the problems that mismatch creates. That's ultimately what it means to be human in the modern world. We're the species that stopped evolving biologically but kept evolving culturally. We're the descendants of survivors who went through the most severe population bottleneck in human history and came out the other side with the mental tools to reshape our entire planet. We're living in bodies designed for a world that no longer exists, trying to build a future that our ancestors couldn't have imagined. And maybe that's exactly as it should be. Maybe the fact that we stopped evolving 70,000 years ago is what allowed us to become the dominant species on Earth. Maybe being evolutionarily frozen gave us the stability and consistency we needed to develop complex cultures and technologies. Maybe we didn't stop evolving because we reached perfection. We stopped evolving because we developed something better than evolution. The ability to change ourselves through knowledge and culture instead of waiting for random mutations and natural selection to do the work for us. The future of human evolution isn't written in our genes anymore. It's written in our choices. And that's both terrifying and exciting in equal measure. So here we are, The end of a story that began 74,000 years ago with a volcanic eruption so massive it nearly erased humanity from existence. We followed those survivors through 74,000 years of desperate adaptation. Watched them emerge from the bottleneck fundamentally changed. Tracked their descendants as they split and spread across the globe. And we've arrived at the most important moment in our entire evolutionary history. The moment when evolution stopped being the main force shaping humanity. 70,000 years ago, something unprecedented happened. Our ancestors didn't just survive the aftermath of the Toba catastrophe. They went beyond the normal rules of biological evolution. The cognitive revolution that emerged from the bottleneck, those enhanced pattern recognition abilities, that improved capacity for abstract thinking, the brain architecture that allowed complex language, these adaptations gave us something no other species had ever possessed: the ability to evolve culturally faster than we could evolve biologically. Think about what that means. For 4 billion years, every living thing on Earth has been shaped by natural selection. Environments change. Populations adapt or go extinct. New challenges emerge. Evolution creates new solutions. But the process takes time. Hundreds of generations, thousands of years, millions of years for major changes. Then along comes Homo sapiens, carrying the genetic legacy of the bottleneck. And suddenly the old rules don't apply anymore. Climate shifts. Instead of waiting hundreds of generations for evolution to give us thicker fur, we invent clothing. New predators appear. Instead of evolving better teeth and claws, we develop better weapons. Food sources disappear. Instead of adapting our digestive systems over thousands of years, we develop new food processing techniques in a single generation. The evidence is overwhelming. Anatomically, we're virtually identical to humans who lived 70,000 years ago. The same bone structure, the same brain size, the same basic body functions. But culturally, technologically, socially, we're completely different. Those ancestors couldn't have imagined agriculture, cities, written language, the internet. Yet they had the same hardware we do, the same biological machinery. What changed wasn't our bodies. It was our software, our culture, our accumulated knowledge, passing not through genes but through teaching and learning. This makes us unique among all species on Earth. Other animals have culture. Chimpanzees teach tool use. Whales have regional song variations. Crows pass knowledge between generations. But no other species has made culture their main adaptation strategy. No other species has stopped evolving biologically because they've gotten so good at evolving culturally. We're living in Stone Age bodies in a modern world. Your brain is optimized for remembering where fruit trees are located and recognizing predators in tall grass. Your digestive system is designed for a varied diet of wild plants and occasional meat. Your social instincts were shaped for groups of 50 to 150 people, not cities of millions. Your stress responses evolved to handle immediate physical threats, not abstract worries about mortgage payments and email notifications. This explains so much about the modern human condition. Why we crave sugar and fat even though we have plenty. Why we feel anxious in situations that pose no real danger. Why we struggle to maintain relationships in communities larger than a few hundred people. We're running 70,000-year-old software on 21st-century hardware requirements. And most remarkably, it still works. But here's the really profound part. That genetic bottleneck, the one that marked every survivor of Toba, is still with us. Every human alive today carries the mark. The evidence of our brush with extinction. When you look at another person, any person from any culture or background, you're looking at a fellow descendant of those survivors. We're all carrying the same genetic legacy, the same fundamental adaptation that allowed our ancestors to outthink, outadapt, and ultimately outlast every other human species on Earth. That's not just a scientific fact. It's a profound statement about human unity. The genetic differences between human populations are trivial. We've been separated for at most 70,000 years. In evolutionary terms, that's nothing. We're one species, one family, all products of the same bottleneck, all beneficiaries of the same cognitive revolution, all living proof that culture can triumph over biology. So what does this mean for humanity's future? If we stopped evolving biologically 70,000 years ago, are we stuck with Stone Age brains forever? The answer is complicated. Yes, strong natural selection has largely stopped shaping human populations. We're not getting bigger brains or better immune systems through evolution anymore. But we're getting something potentially more powerful. We're developing technologies that might let us go beyond biological limitations entirely. Medicine that can cure diseases evolution never prepared us for, tools that can extend our senses and abilities beyond anything natural selection could produce, maybe even genetic engineering that could allow us to guide our own evolution consciously rather than waiting for natural selection to do it blindly. We're standing at another threshold moment in human history. Just as our ancestors 70,000 years ago stood at the crossroads between biological and cultural evolution, we're standing at the crossroads between natural and directed evolution. The choices we make now will shape not just human culture but potentially human biology itself. Before we end, I want to hear from you. If you've made it this far, you're clearly fascinated by this story of our ancient past and what it means for our present. Hit that like button if this video made you think about human evolution differently. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into the forgotten chapters of human history. And most importantly, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. Are you in Africa, where our species was born? Europe, where we outlasted the Neanderthals? Asia, where we absorbed the Denisovans? Every person watching this video is part of this story. You're a living descendant of the greatest survival story ever told. The next time you look in a mirror, remember what you're seeing. Not just an individual, not just a member of your culture or nation, but a representative of the species that survived extinction, went beyond biology, and learned to reshape the world itself. We are Homo sapiens, the wise humans, the bottleneck survivors, the species that stopped evolving because we learned something better. And that's a legacy worth preserving. Sweet dreams.